Professor. It's my pleasure to see you again and talk to you.
Good evening. It's my pleasure.
In a few weeks, in Vienna, a meeting will take place where the nuclear program of Iran will be discussed. Do you think there is actually a certain possibility for all of those parties that will participate to reach a fruitful end?
Well, actually, we've already had 6 rounds of negotiations from April till June, and several of the participants have said we are close to a breakthrough, but finally the negotiators did not manage to find a conclusion and guarantee the return of both the United States and Iran to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear agreement from 2015. And we need to remind our viewers that the United States did not even directly participate in the negotiations. It was only continuously informed by the head of the negotiations, the head of the European External Action Service, about the proceedings and about the negotiating positions of Iran and the other partners. And this will be the same when these countries meet again on November 29 for a 7th round. It has long been unclear whether we will have a 7th round, if Iran will return to the negotiations, because we had a change in the leadership of the country. The more moderate President Rouhani had to resign after 2 terms in office in August, and we have now a more conservative person in the presidency, Ibrahim Raisi, and he has been a vocal critic of the nuclear agreement that Iran signed in July 2015. So we were not certain that Iran will return to Vienna and continue with negotiations. And the new leadership of Iran has taken a lot of time to propose a new meeting date. And we do not yet know what the position of the new Iranian delegation at the negotiations will be. Will they be ready to continue with the negotiations where they stopped in June of this year? Or will they ask for completely new negotiations, as they probably will argue, it's a new government and we have to consider all that has been considered by the previous government and maybe change the Iranian negotiating position?
Could you probably briskly highlight the key points of both sides?
Well, the talks between the parties to the JCPOA plus the United States, which since May 2018 is no longer a party to this agreement, these talks have started only in April of this year, and a lot of time was wasted. Actually, Joseph Biden during the election campaign said he's ready to bring back the United States to the nuclear agreement. But the position the Biden administration took in the early months was that first Iran has to comply again with the norms and rules of the nuclear agreement. Only then will the United States rejoin the JCPOA. Iran saw it differently. They argued, no, first the United States have to rejoin the JCPOA and lift all the nuclear-related sanctions that had been reimposed by the Trump administration after the US withdrawal from the agreement. And only then would Iran start to comply again with its obligations under the nuclear agreement of 2015. So a lot of time was wasted, and only in April of this year, finally, the parties started to negotiate, as I've said, without the direct participation of the United States. What the negotiating position will be on November 29 is different to say, but the previous Iranian presidential administration and the previous negotiators have always rejected what the Biden administration is asking for. Namely, they want an agreement, a new agreement, which is, as they say, longer and stronger than the nuclear agreement from 2015. Well, in the agreement of 2015, the obligations that Iran accepted would have run out after 15 years at the latest. The Trump administration called these the sunset clauses, which they were not willing to accept. They want Iran to permanently take over and accept these obligations. So the Biden administration is taking up this Trump position and says, no, the obligations of Iran have to be extended into the future. We need to make it longer, a new agreement, so that some arrangements do not run out after 8 years, after 10 years, and then finally after 15 years. And by stronger, the Biden administration also takes up issues the Trump administration had with the JCPOA. The Trump administration criticized that the JCPOA does not have binding rules on the Iranian ballistic missile program. And the Trump administration argued that Iran's regional malign activities, as the US called it at the time, were not addressed in the nuclear agreement of 2015. And the Biden administration, by saying we need a stronger agreement, does want at least to include the ballistic missile program in a new agreement, maybe also Iran's so-called malign activities. If the US will insist on this, I don't think we will see a negotiated agreement between the parties to the initial nuclear agreement.
Supposedly, Israel and the other parties would actually come up with a certain consensus. How would it change the situation in the Middle East?
Well, if there will be such an agreement, we will have a synchronized, a parallel process of the US lifting sanctions and Iran returning to compliance with the nuclear agreement of 2015. This would mean that in the region, at least, we will not have any strong incentives for regional powers to start their own nuclear program with a military purpose, as the fact that Iran returns to its initial obligations prohibits Iran from building a nuclear weapon. So that will be a very positive step. However, Israel has criticized the agreement from 2015 strongly because it says it is too weak. It does not fully control the nuclear activities of Iran. Iran should have taken over more obligations, very much in consensus with the position of the Trump administration. And even the current government of Naftali Bennett, coalition government, thinks that a return to the deal by the United States would not be a good idea. And the government of Israel has made it clear that if Iran does not accept a longer and stronger agreement as the United States wanted to accept, then the United States should have a plan B, meaning that the United States should resort to military force to destroy nuclear installations in Iran. And the Israeli government statement went further and argued that if the US has no plan B, then Israel has a plan C, which means that Israel would go it alone militarily to destroy or try to destroy the nuclear installations in Iran. So if there will be an agreement to the initial JCPOA or to a new agreement which is longer and stronger, which I actually do not think is very likely, then we still will have the opposition of Israel against such an agreement. And so in the region, there may continue this sort of coalition between Israel and Saudi Arabia, who are deeply opposed to the idea that one day Iran becomes a nuclear weapon state.
I would be quite surprised if Israel, as an arch enemy, would actually stand with any other opinion that you just explained. Would you say Russia would have any benefits here if Iran would be allowed to have an independent or at least an actual nuclear program?
Well, Iran actually does have the right for a civilian nuclear program. It's a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which demands from all non-nuclear weapon states to stay away from nuclear weapons, not to do research on it, not to build and not to deploy nuclear weapons, not to possess nuclear weapons. But the NPT allows every state who renounces the possession of nuclear weapons to use nuclear energy for civilian purposes. And Iran claims that it has the right to do so. That's why one power plant has already been built and is in operation with Russian support, with Russian technology. And Iran could have more nuclear power plants. Opponents of Iran have always argued, why should Iran have nuclear energy as a source for its energy supply, as it is an oil-rich and gas-rich country. Iran has always answered that it does not want to be reliant so strongly on oil and gas exports. It wants to have, with its electricity supplies, its power supplies, also the option of nuclear power plants. And Iran will not give up this option. But if Iran returns to the JCPOA, a military nuclear program will be impossible, at least for the duration of that nuclear agreement. And so we could, of course, all live with the fact that Iran does have a civilian nuclear program. The problem is that in order to create fuel for civilian nuclear power plants, you need centrifuges to enrich uranium to about 4 or 5%. But with the same technology, you can also enrich uranium up to 90%, which means that uranium is now weapons grade. So it's always difficult if a country does have a civilian nuclear program, it also possesses the technology to go military with its nuclear program. And that cannot be ruled out. So what the 2015 agreement asked from Iran is to continue to allow inspectors by the International Atomic Energy Agency to have very thorough controls of Iran's nuclear installations, precisely to rule out that the civilian program turns into a military program. And even under the existing agreement from 2015, this obligation of Iran does not run out. It's an eternal obligation that Iran has taken over.
You mentioned that Russia is supporting Iran with the facilitating the processes and the work of the single nuclear reactor in the state. Could you name any exact allies of Iran at this specific moment?
Well, the two countries of the Permanent Five which are quite supportive vis-à-vis the Iranian government are Russia and China, of course, but even those loose friends of Iran are opposed to Iran developing and having a nuclear weapon. They don't want Iran to be a nuclear power. So even these limited friends of Iran oppose a nuclear military program. Other friends, actually, Iran doesn't have. States do not side with Iran. But of course, Iran has control over several Shiite militias in the region, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon. So these can be called friends of Iran. They are dependent on Iran. But there's no state actually which is in solidarity with Iran when it comes to its possible military nuclear program. Well, a civilian nuclear program, of course, is something that many countries pursue. In Europe, it's primarily France, which relies on nuclear energy and wants to expand energy by nuclear power plants. So this is in wide use all over the world. Only a few countries have refrained from or even prohibited the construction of power plants on their territory. So if Iran wants to have nuclear power plants, either from Russia or from any other country, that's of course acceptable. With the current only nuclear reactor that Iran possesses, the one in Bushehr, the Russians have insisted that they supply the fuel rods to Iran, and the fuel rods, after they have been used till the end, need to be exported by Iran to Russia. So if Iran would accept such an obligation, namely that it does not itself try to enrich uranium for civilian nuclear power use, but imports primarily from Russia fuel rods for its nuclear power plants, then a major concern about the nature of the Iranian nuclear program would be gone. However, Iran for the past 20 years has always insisted that it does have the right for its own nuclear enrichment program, which is correct. They are entitled and allowed to do so under the NPT. But if the Iranian side would like to dispel rumors or assumptions that Iran is trying to get a nuclear weapon, they should simply stop their nuclear enrichment facilities inside of Iran, in Natanz and in Fordo. But I don't consider this likely. I actually do rule it out.
Do I understand it correctly that basically Russia and the United States, since, well, if we take the time when when Biden became the president of the United States, both those countries haven't developed a specific policy towards Iran gaining nuclear power, nuclear program or not. So there is no clear program of those countries on Iran as of this moment. Would you agree on that?
Well, the United States would prefer Iran not to have a nuclear program at all. They could live with a civilian nuclear program where Iran gets the fuel rods from, say, Russia, and has to give these fuel rods, once they are exhausted, back to the Russian Federation. They could live with that. Russia, of course, is interested that Iran indeed has a civilian nuclear program, because one of the export items Russia has is nuclear power plants. Rosatom, the agency in Russia which is responsible for it, Russia has been building nuclear power plants in many countries. It's an effort in foreign currency for Russia. So Russia indeed wants Iran to build as many nuclear power plants as possible, if they are asking the Russians to build them and if they are paying the Russians for it. So there's a clear interest on the Russian side for a civilian nuclear program. However, also the Russian position is that for such a program, Iran would not necessarily need its own enrichment facilities, as Russia would be willing and, of course, able to provide enriched fuel rods to any of the new nuclear power plants in Iran.
Would you say that the JCPOA could bring rather deleterious consequences in the long run? Would be actually beneficial for not just for Iran, but also for the situation, the stability, and the further development of the region, and probably for other regions too.
When the United States under Trump left the JCPOA, they started with a strategy that they called maximum pressure, with restoring the old nuclear-related sanctions and imposing new sanctions on Iran. They expected the economic and financial consequences of these sanctions to be so strong that Iran will finally give in and negotiate a new agreement, a longer and stronger agreement, though the Biden administration did not call it that way. But Iran's leadership has not actually given in. They have resisted, and they got some support by other countries with circumventing sanctions. So it's not likely that Iran, even with the disastrous consequences of the US sanction regime, will change its position and agree to sign a broader agreement which includes all those elements that both Biden and Trump consider to be missing in the initial agreement. Well, a return by the United States and Iran to the JCPOA would, of course, be a very strong contribution to establish regional stability if this does not happen, what we will see in the region is a nuclear arms race. So yes, a return to the JCPOA would be a significant step. However, as I've said, the United States is not just simply endorsing a return to the initial JCPOA, they want a longer and stronger agreement. And it's not even clear if the Iranian side, under the new presidency of Ibrahim Raisi, is willing to return to the JCPOA, but will ask for more concessions by the Western parties to these negotiations. So we don't know. A return to the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement from 2015, should be possible if both sides make compromises. But at the moment it doesn't look like the United States will drop its demand that an agreement needs to be stronger and longer, and it's not sure that Iran will actually accept a return to the obligations of the nuclear agreement, even if the United States lifts all nuclear-related sanctions on Iran. Iran most likely will try to extend the talks in Vienna for quite a long time, because meanwhile they are in breach of the JCPOA obligations. They do enrich uranium now up to 60%. They have more than the allowed 300 kilograms of lowly enriched uranium, which brings them closer to a nuclear breakout scenario. But the United States, realizing of course that time is on the Iranian side, has announced already a couple of times that the window for a negotiated solution is closing, and that Iran does not have a lot of time to come back in compliance with the JCPOA. And so we will have additional difficulties. The Iranian side is quite happy to have negotiations well into next year. The US and also its European allies would not want to accept this.